Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Michelle Pitkin and I'm the chair of the Fire Risk Management Group. Today I'm joined by John Field, who is one of my vice chairs, who will be presenting for you this afternoon. We're also joined by Daniel Pyatt, who is a committee member, who will be helping to answer your questions throughout the session and who will be joining us for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you would like to ask any questions during John's presentation, please pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat function, and we can pick them up from there. Today's presentation will be available on the Fire Risk Management Group page on the IOSH website, as well as the IOSH YouTube page, so you don't have to worry about taking lots of notes. So to our speaker this afternoon, John Field. John worked with Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, gaining 17 years experience, reaching the position of Operational Watch Manager, spending 5 years as a Fire Safety Inspecting Officer. Within the role of FSIO, he was the Houses in Multiple Occupancy Officer, liaising with the 3 unitary authorities within the county. He is now the Head of Health and Safety and Head of Safety for the University of the Imperial College London, heading up a team of 6 fire safety officers. The experience gained working within the emergency services and a university environment gives John the ability to assess situations from the perspective of both a fire safety inspector and a fire safety risk assessor. John is qualified to a level 4 diploma fire safety inspector. He has the NEBOSH National General Certificate and the NEBOSH Fire Safety and Risk Management qualification. Having gained a level 6 professional graduate certificate in education and a level 7 advanced professional diploma in management studies, John is currently studying towards a level 7 MSc in risk and safety management. Outside of work, John has been a member of the Fire Risk Management Group Committee for the past 3 years, and as I've mentioned, he's currently one of my 2 vice chairs. I'm sure that you all would agree that with this experience, John is well placed to present this annual fire safety update. And with that, I now hand you over to John for today's presentation. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Michelle, for that fantastic introduction. Let me make sure I get the right screen. Okay, and welcome everybody. I know there's lots of people from all over the world, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night indeed, wherever you might be. This is being recorded. If you do fall asleep, then you can always catch up later. This is one of our annual fire safety updates. There has been quite a few updates with regards to legislation and guidance most recently, and the idea is to present this information to you to get an idea of those updates. There's a lot to get through today, so it is in essence a whistle-stop tour, but perhaps if there's popular demand on certain areas, people want more in-depth knowledge and understanding, then perhaps we can host further webinars to actually define those particular areas. The items we'll actually be looking at are the Building etc. Amendment England Regulations 2022, the Approved Document B 2022 updates, the Fire Safety Act 2021. We have discussed that in the previous legal update, but there has been progress on that, and the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022. Why have we had these changes? It was basically recommendations made to the government as a result of the Grenfell inquiry, the phase 1 report. I think we all know about this incident, and it's very important that we remember where it comes from. And there's lots and lots of changes and guidance that have been changed and legislation as a result of this, but it all seamlessly fits together, which is why I've put so much information into this presentation. The Building etc. Amendment England Regulations 2022. Okay, so why have the changes? What are the changes that have come about? So it amends the Building Regulations 2010. That was the previous legislation, and ultimately this makes amendments to that as a result of the Grenfell inquiry. It was introduced in June the 1st, 2022, and it'll actually come into force in December the 1st, 2022. It extends to England and Wales, but it doesn't actually apply to Wales. It only applies to buildings in the UK. And if we can share the first link in the comments, please, that would be fantastic. As we go along, there will be certain links to web links being shared in the comments, and those will give you access to various different documents that I'm talking about. You don't necessarily need to look at them right now, but the idea is for you to look at a later date, perhaps. What are the changes? Well, the Building Etc. Amendment England Regulations 2022 strengthens building regulations. Following a review and consultation, the government has introduced regulations to strengthen the ban on combustible materials used in and on the external walls of buildings. The ban on combustible materials in and on the external walls of buildings, introduced in 2018, will now apply to hotels, hostels, boarding houses, in addition to blocks of flats, hospitals, student accommodation, dormitories in boarding schools. So ultimately it strengthens that ban on the materials and extends the different buildings to which it covers. There's more changes. The changes will also ban the metal composite material panels with unmodified polyethylene core, known as MCMPE. We know there's all different types of composite materials that have been used on the insulation, on the outside of the buildings, and this is yet one more that has been banned as it's been found to be highly flammable. And it's all on all new builds at any height. And this follows research carried out by the government and evidence heard at the Grenfell Tower inquiry on the serious fire safety risk associated with these materials. Other changes to the regulations being put forward include elements of solar shading devices. So these are the elements that are on the outside of a building that stop the sun beaming through into heavily glazed buildings. The amend list of materials exempt from the ban as well, because sometimes when they put a ban in, people can misconstrue what it is that is and isn't allowed. And ultimately it extends to the fibre optic cables, waterproofing, insulation materials in the external wall below and up to 300 mil from the ground level. So there's elements that have actually been taken out from the exemption. There's an update, the requirements of the ban to refer to the latest version of the British Standard EN 13501, Part 1 classification for materials used on high-rise residential buildings, debris exempt cavity trays, and amend the requirements for material change of use in buildings. Then we go on to approved document B. So we covered this in the last legislation update, but there have since been some more changes. Some of these were not included last time because they required further consideration, specifically by the National Fire Chiefs Council, and this time they've introduced them. They've seen fit to introduce them in this element. So, brief background for approved document B. There are two volumes. Volume 1 is dwellings, and Volume 2 is buildings other than dwellings. The guidance allows you to comply with the Building Regulations 2010 and also the element I've just discussed, the Building Etc. Amendment England Regulations 2022. So if you want to know how to apply that legislation, you look at the guidance, but it is just that, it's guidance. It helps you apply the law. If you don't go by the guidance, then you must show how you have actually complied by the law. But the approved documents are parts A to R, so there's not just ADB, there's A to R and Regulation 7. And in fact, Part B actually applies to fire safety. So if you could put the second web link in the comments, please. Specifically, what are the changes? Well, as I've said before, it amends the Building Regulations 2010 and it will come into force on the 1st of December 2022. So a building that's currently going through application and received planning permission aren't required to fulfil these requirements. However, those that are going through planning permission and receive a granted planning permission on or after the 1st of December will be required to put these in place. But there are only a couple of elements that aren't covered later on for existing buildings anyway. So again, it extends to England and Wales, but doesn't actually apply to buildings in Wales. For the changes focus on the following safety provisions. There's a ban on combustible materials in and on the external walls of buildings, consequential amendments following the laying of the Building Amendments Regulation, as I've mentioned earlier. There's a couple of sections within ADB, provisions for residential buildings with a story 11 metres or more in height. There's updates provisions in section 10 and 12 of both volumes for those residential buildings, purpose groups 1 and 2. It introduces the requirement for secure information boxes in blocks of flats with stories over 11 metres. And we will see this further on, and I'll give a bit more detail as to what these secure information boxes are. And one that was excluded last time because the National Fire Chiefs Council wanted to check it out themselves. This now introduces the requirement for evacuation alert systems in blocks of flats with stories over 18 metres. These are systems that are installed that give a warning to the different residents of flats, and it's for the fire service to be able to evacuate people within floors, individual flats or floors, stories within flats if required. Fire Safety Act 2021, again, we covered this in the last legislation update, but there has been an added element to it. So it came into force on June the 7th, 2021. Extends to England and Wales. However, only certain elements apply in England. In essence, it gave clarity to the fire safety order, and it basically covers any building with 2 or more domestic premises and with a shared common area. It's divided into 4 sections. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to those sections. I will be looking at sections 1 and 3. If we could add the 3rd web link to the comments box, please, that would be appreciated. So, in the case of multi-occupied residential buildings, in essence, it puts beyond doubt that the structure, external walls, and flat entrance doors fall within the scope of the fire safety order. There was some confusion and concern before. Fire and rescue services struggled to prosecute, secure a prosecution and actually take people to court because there was a slight lack of clarity. Does the front door cover, is it covered in the fire safety order or not? The Fire Safety Act will require the responsible person to ensure that these elements are included in their fire risk assessment if they have not been covered already. So this, in essence, is part of the update. It actually amends Article 6 of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which describes what a domestic premise is. is. If we could add the fourth web link to the comments box, please, that would be fantastic. So the Fire Safety Act, sections 1 and 3 actually commenced on the 16th of May 2022. They kind of snuck up on us. Section 1, again, 2 or more domestic premises that actually share a common space. It's for the responsible person must take account of the structure, external walls and flat entrance doors in a fire risk assessment. And in essence, the government are now kind of pushing that this is a must. Before, there was waiting for guidance to be produced with regards to how people could fulfil this element of the Act. And now there's been an introduction or production of the Fire Risk Assessment Prioritisation Tool. It's an online tool designed to support responsible people or persons to develop a prioritisation strategy in updating their fire risk assessments following commencement of Section 1 of the Fire Safety Act. So in essence, it's basically saying if you haven't included those elements within your fire risk assessment yet, you need to. And there's a reason why this was introduced on the 16th of May, and we'll look at that in a moment in the other parts of legislation and guidance. If we could have the, you'll see the web link in there to this prioritisation tool. So further, Section 3 of the Fire Safety Act makes it clear that if a responsible person has followed Article 50 of the Fire Safety Order, then in essence, they can show compliance. By using this fire risk assessment tool, this is evidence of compliance under the Fire Safety Order. So if they used it, they can show compliance. If they haven't used it, then it's possibly that they haven't showed compliance. So Section 50 requires that someone, Section 3 applying to Article 50 requires a person to show that they've complied with this fire safety order. One of those ways of doing that is by using guidance. This tool, in essence, is guidance. So if it's used, you can show compliance. If it's not used, then you must show compliance in some other way, or you could end up in court, unfortunately. So the responsible person or competent fire risk assessor acting on the responsible person's behalf should undertake a visual inspection of the external walls. PAS 9980 provides a methodology for the fire risk assessment appraisal of external wall construction and cladding. In many cases, it may be blatantly obvious from a visual inspection that the risk to life from external fire spread is not such to warrant a 9980 assessment. And this is particularly true in buildings with brick or masonry, external walls or low-risk buildings, which do not present any significant risk of fire spread. So in essence, you could do this yourself. You could look, is it brick built? Yes. Well, I don't need to utilise 9980 then. I'm happy that there's perhaps nothing on the external wall that could promote fire spread. However, if it's perhaps unsure or there are certain elements that may promote fire risk, then a more detailed fire risk appraisal of the external walls under 9980 may be required. And ultimately, it's for the responsible person to introduce a competent person that can actually assess that, and the 9980 is a good guide for using. And there will be a link to this document in the comments box. Fire Safety England regulations. We've already had one piece of legislation and the guidance that supports it. Now we're having this element of the legislation. So the Fire Safety England regulations 2022. Why was it needed? It was introduced under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. It is law, and it's for the responsible person of high-rise blocks of flats to provide information to the Fire and Rescue Service to assist them to plan and provide effective operational response. When you attend a block of flats from a fire service perspective, there's lots going on. You have to wait for all the appliances to turn up, the right number of people, the right equipment to be ready before you can attend the scenes of operations and even consider attacking the fire. So this was introduced to ensure that the Fire and Rescue Services could do this effectively, laying on the requirements of the responsible person. And you'll see a link to this in the comments box. So Article 24 of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order can impose requirements on the responsible person and others, including building owners and building managers, in relation to mitigating risk to residents for specific premises. So this is how the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 was introduced. It comes into force on the 23rd of January 2023. So yes, we do need to take note of it. Yes, we do need to start taking action, but there is a certain amount of action that we can't take due to it being the responsibility of the Fire and Rescue Service and indeed guidance that's being produced by the government, but that hasn't actually been introduced as of yet. Once again, it extends to England and Wales, but only applies in England, and the regulations exclude the Houses of Parliament, Houses of Commons, sorry, and any military premises. So for the purposes of this regulation, the definition of a high-rise building is 2 or more domestic premises at least 18 metres above ground, at least 7 stories tall, and the height is measured as per ADB. The regulation actually stipulates the measurement is as per ADB to give a yardstick, as it were. Now, stories below ground are ignored. My apologies, clicked on that too quick. And a mezzanine, in essence, is a story if it's at least 50% of the internal floor area of the largest story in buildings not below ground. So just a bit of extra information for you there. So the Fire Safety England Regulation 2022 brings 7 main regulations. One of those, as discussed, is covered in ADB. So that was for buildings that were going to be built. This is now for buildings that are already built. So as I mentioned before, it's not going to be buildings that are built already that are going to miss out on the majority of these requirements. So there is a requirement, or there will be a requirement for buildings that are already built to have secure information boxes. Now, originally they were called property information boxes, but then someone realised that that's actually a Girder trade name. So they had to quickly change the name to secure information boxes. Design and materials of external walls, floor plans and building plan, lifts and essential firefighting equipment, wayfinding signage. If you recall, this was introduced with the last update of ADB for obviously buildings that were being built. So this was included in the last update for ADB. Information to residents, and then an element on fire doors. So I'll go through each of these regulations individually now. So section 4 is to do with a secure information box, or perhaps you want to call it a SIM. It's up for the residential person in relation to a high-rise residential building, have a secure information box, and this is the key thing, in or on the high-rise building. It doesn't have to be on the outside of the building, and in fact the fire and rescue service would prefer them to be on the inside of the building, purely because it keeps them safe. There is a possibility that they may in fact be vandalised if they're on the outside, and that would either discourage responsible persons from having them, or from putting the necessary information and access, etc., within the boxes. The secure information basically must install and maintain the box. The secure information must be positioned in a location or in or on the building which is readily accessible to the fire and rescue authority, capable of containing documents required to be placed in it by these regulations, and there are specific elements, and I'll talk about them in a sec. Reasonably secure from unauthorised access and vandalism. So the responsible person must ensure that the following information is contained within the secure information box. The name and address and telephone number within the United Kingdom of the responsible person. So many times as a watch manager within the fire and rescue service would turn up to blocks of flats to carry out an inspection, and we couldn't identify who was responsible for the building. It became quite difficult. This now requires that someone within the UK, details of that person are shared with the fire service. The name and contact information of such other persons within the UK who are provided with the facilities to and are permitted to access the building as the responsible person considers appropriate. So it could be that someone is on call or someone is required to attend the building to assess or to address certain items, and those persons' details are required to. It may be that the fire and rescue service can't get hold of the original RP, so they then need to make contact with someone else. And this allows for that. Copies of the building's floor plans, which identify specific key firefighting equipment, and a single page block plan, which identifies specified key firefighting equipment. Now, as a officer in charge of an incident, it is extremely difficult to manage an incident. You have to make dynamic decisions instantly. And in order to do that, you need as much information as you can. And if it's in a format that's easily accessible and easy to read, then that will assist greatly in addressing the incident. So, must provide the local fire and rescue service authority with anything required to enable it to access the secure information box. It could be a key, perhaps, and must provide anything additional required as soon as reasonably practicable if there are any changes to these requirements. So any changes, the fire and rescue service must be given this information. And they must, the responsible person must inspect the secure information box at least annually, and their contents kept up to date. And this is as per the fire safety order. And there should be a link to the National Fire Chief's document on these boxes, secure information boxes. From my perspective, with regards to my employer, I'm going to encourage them to perhaps facilitate a box similar to that in the picture on the inside of the building, because my accommodation is student accommodation, has 24-hour security. So access can be easily granted, maybe even have the box behind reception because it's managed 24/7. So I'm not going to encourage my employer to put something on the outside of the building that could get broken into. Each person's situation is different. I don't actually manage blocks of flats. An arm of my employer do, but again, they're fully managed accommodation. So because they're 24/7 concierge and security, I would encourage them to have it on the inside of the building. Regulation 5, the design and materials of external walls. The responsible person in relation to a high-rise residential building must prepare a record of the design of the external walls of the building, including details of the materials from which they are constructed. The record must include details and level of risk identified in the risk assessment required under Article 9 of the Fire Safety Order, that the design and materials of the external walls give rise to, and any mitigating steps that have been taken in respect to that risk. So the fire risk assessment should identify what risk does the external wall systems pose and what have you done about mitigating that risk. So as I said, these all link in from earlier. Just because the building's already built doesn't mean you're going to get away with not complying with the legislation that's coming in for new builds. Must inform the fire rescue service of any changes. Must prepare a revised record if there are any significant changes to the external walls of the building. Provide the fire and rescue service a level of risk spread, as I explained. So that's actually identified to the fire and rescue service. However, you don't present it in the format of your fire risk assessment. Although it needs to be put in the fire risk assessment, it needs to be in an understandable format and given to the fire and rescue service. Now, a lot of these records need to be provided electronically. As I said earlier, at the moment, out of all the, I think it's 43 fire and rescue services within the country, I don't believe a single one of them have come forth yet to identify how they're going to receive electronically and store this information. So the National Fire Chiefs Council are working on a platform that will allow for this to be facilitated. And there's lots of discussion, part of a roundtable group who discuss this on a regular basis. Regulation 6, floor plans and building plans. The responsible person for a high-rise residential building. So as I've said, at different heights of different buildings, nothing's ever simple in health and safety or fire safety. And ultimately, there is a summary at the end which clarifies, well, what building is covered under what. But for a high-rise residential building, must prepare a plan for each floor of the high-rise and share them electronically with their local fire and rescue service. The floor plans must together identify the location of all the lifts and identify if the lift is for use for firefighting or an evac lift and the basically key firefighting equipment in the entire building. So in essence, you don't need to provide a plan for each floor if they're identical on each floor. The responsible person must also prepare a single-page building plan identifying the environs of the building, details of the use of the building, access for firefighting appliances, dimensions of the building, number of stories, including basement levels, the presence of masonettes or scissor section flats. So you've got 2 floors on the flats and you go in a set of stairs internally, inlets for dry risers, wet risers, location of shut-off controls for sprinklers, access points for the building, where the information box is, controls for smoke control systems, where the firefighting shaft is, the main stairwells in the building, and key controls for any evacuation alert systems. And it's important to remember a hard copy of these floor plans must be stored in a secure information box, and the plans must be updated with any changes that occur. Regulation 7, lifts and essential firefighting equipment. Again, this is in a high-rise building. So the responsible person must undertake a monthly routine check of lifts for use by firefighters, evacuation lifts, and essential firefighting equipment within the building. It could be difficult for some. If you've got a large building with many floors, you might have a lot of firefighting equipment. But again, remember, this is only equipment that's to be used by the fire service, but it still needs a monthly routine check. So that would be a check. Does it work, yes or no? If there are any faults, then they must rectify the fault where it's identified with a lift for use by firefighters, evacuation lifts, or piece of essential firefighting equipment. Where a fault cannot be rectified within a 24-hour period, they must, as soon as reasonably practicable, report the fault to the local fire and rescue authority by electronic means. At the moment, there isn't a method of facilitating that, but if it's longer than 24-hour period that it's going to be out of service, this firefighting lift or equipment or evac lift, you must inform the fire service, and then you must notify them when the fault's been rectified. Also, must be a record of the monthly checks, and that should be stored somewhere locally. And I've gone through already what those firefighting equipment, essential firefighting equipment, covers. And the routine check means that any lift or piece of equipment is in effective working order and in good repair, carried out in accordance with the relevant industry standard or any recommendations made by the manufacturer of equipment within an operator's manual. So Regulation 8, wayfinding. Again, this was introduced in ADB in the last update. So the responsible person in relation to a high-rise building must ensure that the building contains clear markings of floor identifications and identification of domestic premises. And the markings means an identification designed and location in accordance with ADB. So if you look at ADB Volume 1, you'll get a clear definition. It identifies the size of the signs, the height off the floor, because if you remember, the smoke layer may come down and may obscure any normal signs. So these are required to be put in certain places, and to effectively improve the speed in which the firefighters attend the right door, it identifies which way they should go on a landing. Regulation 9, in relation to a building that contains, this is slightly different, it's not high rise, 2 or more sets of domestic premises with a common part. This is basically every building. Must display fire safety instructions in a conspicuous place, must be comprehensible for the residents, could be reasonably expected to understand it, and include instructions relating to the evacuation strategy, how to report an incident to the fire and rescue authority, any instructions that tells residents what they must do when a fire occurs. Must provide this to new residents and all residents of domestic premises within the building within each period of 12 months. So ultimately, every 12 months, they must be reminded of this and after any material changes. So it must be displayed within the communal areas, such as the lobby or conspicuous parts of the building. And there must be a copy provided to each resident. Regulation 10, the responsible person, so any building in essence, provide information about fire doors to the residents, So its fire doors should be kept shut when not in use. Residents or their guests should not tamper with self-closing devices. Kind of obvious, but it's still important to reiterate. Residents report any faults or damages with doors immediately to the responsible person. And the required information must be provided to, again, the new residents or all residents of domestic premises, and ultimately every 12 months they must be given a reminder. The second part of the regulation, but this only covers formal domestic premises over 11 metres in height, not 11 metres and over, but over 11 metres in height. They must use their best endeavours to undertake checks of fire doors at the entrances of individual domestic premises at least every 12 months. This can be hard to gain access to residents' doors or flats. So if they refuse, they must still persist to some extent, but record this process of them trying and make an attempt to access these doors. Basically, every 12 months, undertake checks of any fire doors in communal areas of the building every 3 months. And again, the checks must include ensuring that the self-closing devices for the doors are working. And again, this needs to be recorded. So in essence, in summary, this table shows where each type of the building fits in with the new changes in legislation and guidance. Now, I appreciate this has been a real whistle-stop tour and a quick rush through, but hopefully this will kind of clarify matters somewhat, and it may be that people refer back to the recording of this to gain a bit more information. But again, if anyone wants more information on specific element of the legislation, then please do shout to the fire risk management group, and I'm sure we'll be happy to put something on and give more detail. So existing buildings, 2 or more domestic premises with common areas, that covers the Fire Safety Act, Fire Risk Assessment Prioritisation Tool, Regulation 9 of the Fire Safety England Regulation, and Regulation 10. So that's to do with fire safety information and information about fire doors, providing the residents with that information. 11 metres or more in height, ADB sections 10 and 12, volumes 1 and 2. To be constructed and existing buildings, if they're more than 11 metres in height. Why they couldn't keep this simple, I don't know, but there we go. Again, ADB, secure information boxes, and Regulation 10 checks on the fire doors to flats and corridors. Existing buildings, 18 metres or more in height, Regulation 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then to be constructed buildings more than 18 metres in height, ADB, the evacuation alert system. So I hope that clarifies matters in succinct fashion of what I've just described and commented on. Okay, I will now end the share, and I will ask Daniel, do we have questions, and can we give responses to those questions?
Hello, John. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions. I think Michelle's going to come in and put them to us.
I am, yeah. There's been lots coming in. Daniel's been replying as fast as he can to as he has been able to. I'd just like to say, if your question doesn't get asked this afternoon, I've got 28 open questions, conscious of time and only 10 minutes remaining. We will be downloading all the questions and we will be answering them as a group, which will then be published on the Fire Risk Management Group page. So if your question doesn't get answered this afternoon, it will be answered after the webinar. The first few questions that we've had come in are around the changes and whether or not they would apply to care homes in addition to hospitals. Question to either of you.
Very good question. I would suggest there is a difference between care homes and hospitals. However, I would suggest it would be prudent to consider any sleeping risk. It seems there's a plethora of sleeping risks being included for clarification. So I would suggest any kind of sleeping risk should be considered in order to prevent from the fire service bringing any prosecutions, etc. If you can show you're complying with this new legislation, then I think you would go a long way of making the building safer. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of covered it there, really. I mean, most of this applies to residential buildings. Building regulations obviously applies to all buildings, respectively, for dwellings and buildings other than dwellings. So, yeah.
No, that's great, guys. We've just actually had a comment come in from somebody who's attending Tim Dixon. Thanks for just popping your comment in there. Yeah, care homes fall under the CQC restriction. So people might also need to refer to HTM, the HTM standard, as well as the fire regulations there. So thank you very much for that chat box there, Tim. Lots of questions around Scotland and whether or not anything will be brought in specifically for Scotland and how the new legislation and the regulations may affect Scotland.
Unfortunately, generally law within England only covers England and Wales. Scotland are a separate entity altogether. As we can see, a lot of the legislation, although it covers Wales, the specific elements aren't covered in Wales. So I would suggest that none of this would be relevant in Scotland. However, quite often Scotland either set the pace or they introduce something very similar. So I would suggest that as a fire risk management group, we'll keep an eye out to see developments within Scotland, and we can actually, now you've made that comment, provide a webinar specifically for Scottish updates. I think that would be a suitable approach.
I think one thing else to add is obviously a lot of this is guidance and supporting the wider risk management on fire. If there isn't any guidance in Scotland, then you would be diligent in a way to kind of look at what's available elsewhere and see what else is happening elsewhere to see whether you could apply it in one way, shape or form until such time that Scotland do release their own guidance.
Yeah, I think I've just made a note for maybe a specific Scotland update as a separate webinar. We'll keep an eye out as to any updates that we receive. So do we know if past 79 will be updated to include these changes, particularly around external cladding? So have we heard anything?
At the moment, past 79 seems to be up in the air because the residential element, there was a legal challenge by some of the families of residents of Grenfell. So the residential element is being challenged due to PEEPs, although the government have kind of made a stance with regards to the fact they're not including PEEPs in any of these guidance or legislation updates, etc. I would suggest 9980 is perhaps the pass to go to with regards to external wall systems rather than specifically past 79. And again, it's one of those where Daniel alluded to it earlier. If you've got something available, you have to include it as well. You can't just include it. Well, PAS 79 doesn't mention this, but if 9980 is available, then you've got to consider it, and you've got to introduce it. And now the legislation specifically says using 9980. So I would specifically say, just because it's not included in PAS 79 doesn't mean that you don't consider the external wall systems. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think this is a good opportunity, really, because I hear a lot of questions in a lot of places about PAS 79. And obviously, the templates in PAS 79 for residential, it's a broad template. You know, it's for you as the risk assessor, as the responsible person, to look at the template and see how it fits with your organisation. I use PAS 79 in the organisation I work for, and I added questions to fit the needs of our buildings, and I've removed questions to fit the needs of our buildings. So the template they provide is, you know, is a foundation that can be worked upon. Just like PAS 79 is actually a methodology for carrying out risk assessment. It's not just the template on the end, it's the methodology that supports that. And I think a lot of people from conversations that I have forget that, you know, PAS 79 is a methodology and the template is there to kind of support that process. So.
Yeah, some good points there from both of you. And I think, yeah, we have to remember that it's a template for us to follow. Sorry, all my questions are jumping about. They're still coming in. I've got 60 open questions now. So we've got 5 minutes left. We aren't going to be able to answer them all. But as I say, we will download them afterwards and they will be published on the Fire Risk Management Group microsite on the IOSH website. We will also publish them on our LinkedIn page as well. So I think we've got time for maybe one more question, and it was around the requirement to inspect fire doors every 3 months, a requirement for buildings under 11 metres. If not, what is the requirement?
So ultimately, I would suggest annually fire doors be inspected if it falls outside the guidance because it's not tall enough. This is all to do with protecting the means of escape. A lot of the buildings are single stair, which is a different issue at the moment, and we could probably do a separate webinar on single staircases and so on. So my suggestion would be making sure that these doors are checked periodically, which would be on an annual basis. But what the updates on the legislation have actually done is made it law. Some of it a must, but some of it your best endeavours, which means you must go over and above to try and do these checks. So i.e. the doors for the flats. The common part doors you can do anyway every 3 months, but it actually makes it a legal requirement to do that. And it's purely identified there for the buildings of these heights because the means of escape is that much more critical, whereas sort of less buildings in less height, it's still critical, but I would specify it's possibly easier and quicker to get out of the buildings, and I would specify the annual checks would be suitable. Daniel, what have you got?
Hello. Sorry, I've got people. Could you just step out the room for me, please? I've got people coming into the room. Yeah, I mean, the last thing to add on that is one of the questions that's come around again is this whole best endeavours. You know, ultimately, they want you to make sure that you do everything you can to check the door of a residential building. That would mean, you know, writing to the person of the flat and saying, you know, on this time and date, we're going to come in and check your door. If they refuse, keep a note of what they've said, and then try again, and basically be able to demonstrate that you've done everything you can to gain access to check the door. And that's the best endeavours ever, part of it that, you know, seems to be a question. So, you know, do what you can, keep a record, and then that way, you know, you're able to demonstrate to the fire and rescue service that you have done everything you can. So
that's great. Well, no, sorry, John. You're going to.
I was going to say, good points there, Daniel. Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Lots to consider, and lots to consider outside of what is guidance as well. I am looking at my clock, and I have 2 minutes left to officially finish. We do have 66 open questions. So after the webinar, myself, Daniel, and John will be following those up. The presentation, the slides, and the questions will be available on the Fire Risk Management Group microsite on the IOSH website. The recording will be available on the IOSH YouTube page, and we will also post it on our LinkedIn page as well. So with that, I am going to close today's webinar. John, thank you very much for such an informative session. There's been lots to take away from today. Daniel, thanks for joining us for the Q&A and for keeping those questions down. We've now got 71 coming in. Ben has been hiding in the background, making sure that the technical side works for us. So thank you to Ben for keeping things running smoothly. I would just like to mention to everybody that the Fire Risk Management Group Committee will be meeting in early 2023 to plan next year's event. If you've got any suggestions on a topic that you would like us to present on, please do drop us an email either via IOSH, or you can find us on LinkedIn under the IOSH Fire Risk Management Group, where you can send us a direct message. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. As I say, everything will be available to you after today. We hope to see you again soon. And as I say, if you've got any suggestions of future webinars or events, please do let us know. But from myself and from John, thank you for attending and have a great day. Goodbye.